Thank you for listening to Footnotes, a Fellowship Mosaic podcast. This is a space for us to dig deeper into Scripture, what is happening in our community and culture, and continue the conversations we start on Saturday nights. We are excited to have you join us as we pursue truth, holiness, and redemption together.
Well, hello and welcome back to Footnotes. It's Nick here, and thankful to be with you today and continue from our discussion on Saturday night about the tricky issue of slavery in the Scriptures. And so want to just kind of unpack a little bit more some of the issues surrounding this difficult topic, and at the same time also hopefully give us some practical ways to talk about slavery and how to understand the Christian tradition around slavery. And so I want to start with the passage that we looked at this last Saturday night, which was from 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And in that passage, Paul tells that anyone who is currently living as a slave to not worry about it, to not be concerned about it. And this passage has been used by people to suggest that people who are in slavery should just sit tight, don't worry about it, in the sense that it's okay, and it's been used to justify slavery. And so I think we need to understand, what does Paul mean when he says don't worry? We talked about this on Saturday night, that he is not here in any way endorsing slavery. Rather, in the context of the whole passage of chapter 7, what Paul is saying is that because we are living in a time in history where we are in the overlap of the old creation and the new creation, the urgency of the mission is so great that we should be willing to sacrifice everything for the sake of Jesus, that we should be ready to live out our faith in a really radical way. And so therefore, he is saying to people who are enslaved, do not let your slave status worry you that your life is not meaningful with Jesus, or that you're not living the full life God had for you. And we talked about how this really goes against a lot of Western notions of self-actualization, and the idea that we need to kind of become our most full self in the sense of living out all of our gifts and thriving. And Paul is suggesting to the Corinthians, actually, you may be called to live a life of suffering for Christ, and to understand that that could be the most fulfilling thing and the most meaningful life to have. Now, the question then becomes, so is the New Testament, and even more significantly in some ways, to frame it this way, is God not concerned with slavery? And that's the question we really need to get to the bottom of and talk a little bit about. So we're just going to survey a couple of important passages to try to get our minds around this. A couple of important ones to look at. One comes from the book of Ephesians. And in Ephesians, Paul is addressing different members of a household. And so he's kind of, the structure of the New Testament world, the first century Roman world, would have been around a household, and the household would have included family and servants or slaves in the household. So he's addressing everyone in the household, and he says, husbands, love your wives, wives, submit to your husbands, children, obey your parents, and then parents, fathers specifically, don't exasperate your children. And then it says, slaves, obey your earthly masters. This is Ephesians chapter 6, verse 5. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly, as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each one for whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free. And masters, verse 9, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. Now, in our 21st century modern culture, we could read Paul here and go, why didn't Paul just command masters to set their slaves free? Wouldn't that be the obvious answer? And one of the things that this really fails to take into account is the culture that they're in and the method of cultural transformation that the New Testament practiced in the first century. Interestingly, I'm not aware of any place in the New Testament where the church is charged to do what we would today call structural change of society. Now, that doesn't mean that people should not do structural change. They shouldn't be involved in government. They shouldn't advocate for law change, anything like that. But what it does say is that in the first century context, that was not a democracy, that there were no resources for the church to make changes like that at a large scale. What they focused on was changing people through discipleship, calling people to live in such a way that they reflected Christ. And if you look at this command, like if you imagine this command that Paul gives to slaves and masters actually lived out, this destroys everything that is wrong with slavery. He tells the slaves, I'm going to read this again, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. So first of all, he is calling slaves, people who are enslaved, to serve with a wholeness of heart and integrity. He's giving them agency, telling them that they are not forced to do this, but they are actually called to do it as an act of love and obedience to the Lord. This is, I think, a similar thing to what Jesus is doing when he tells his disciples to turn the other cheek. He says, if someone forces your jacket, give them your tunic as well. If someone forces you to carry their bag for a mile, hey, go ahead and carry it too. And what Jesus is doing in this radical way is he's giving agency back to people. He's saying no one can force you to do anything, but you're going to reject that abuse in a very surprising way. The more secular, non-Christ-centered way of rejecting abuse is to fight back. A great example of this is Moses, whenever he saw an Egyptian master beating an Israelite slave. And what did Moses do? He went out and murdered the slave master. And what Jesus modeled was something radical. He said, if you begin that violent uprising approach, you're just going to shed blood everywhere. But instead, if you refuse to obey because you're forced or you're abused, but rather do it out of love, suddenly you're not a slave anymore. You're not a slave to that person anymore. And he says here, notice that when he addresses the masters, he calls the masters to recognize that both them and their slave are actually servants of God, who is in heaven. And so the slave is told to actually do all of your service to Christ and act like you're Christ's emissary serving this master in earth. And then he looks at the masters and he says, treat your slaves in the same way. This is so radical, to tell a master to treat their slaves in the same way the slaves are to treat the masters, serving them, not to threaten them, recognizing that there is no distinction between the slave and the master before God. If a household actually lived this out, suddenly slaves would be more like a family member. They would be more like people in the household. So this is a radical transformation of the whole idea of slavery that fits very well in line with how the New Testament handles all kinds of sin and abuse, and even the idea that we are to be prepared for persecution. Now, in case there's any confusion here, in 1 Timothy chapter 1, Paul is addressing all kinds of. He has one of these many lists of sins and kind of vices that people struggle with, and he says in 1 Timothy 1 verse 8, we know the law is good if one uses it properly. We also know that the law is made not for the righteous, but for lawbreakers and rebels, the ungodly and sinful, the unholy and irreligious. So he's saying the law is there to punish and restrict people who are living unholy lives of rebellion. And then he begins to list what those are. Those who kill their fathers or mothers, for murderers, for the sexually immoral, for those practicing homosexuality, for slave traders and liars and perjurers, and for whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine that conforms to the gospel concerning the glory of the blessed Lord, which he entrusted to me. This is absolutely explicit. This is an absolutely explicit statement from Paul that slave trading is contrary to the doctrine that conforms to the gospel concerning the glory of the blessed God. There is an explicit statement here that treating people as property is sin. And so what we need to see is that the New Testament is laying a foundation to say this practice of treating someone as property is not what God designed for human beings. This is not how we are to behave. It is sinful. And I think the best way to understand what's happening in the New Testament is that God is choosing to work within the structures that exist, teaching people how to live a life of discipleship to Jesus, and inside the structures that they are in, rather than focusing their energy on changing those structures. And now, once again, I want to reiterate this again and again. We now live in a democracy. We live with an incredible amount of agency to be able to change structures. I'm not saying that we shouldn't change structures, but even let's imagine if this approach had been taken in the 19th century in the United States. What if, without any civil war, without any change in laws, if every Christian in the United States had said, hey, this thing of buying and selling people, that's not what we're going to do. We are going to instead treat enslaved people from Africa as if they're our brothers and sisters in Christ. We're going to provide for them. We're going to care for them. We're going to give them good work, and we're going to provide ways for them to become free and to live a life of freedom and destroy the racial barriers between us and them. And if Christians had voluntarily done that, I don't think we get a civil war. I don't think we have to have all of the battles that happened if Christians simply acted with integrity, what God called them to. So, there's a lot more we could talk about around the issue of slavery, but something that I think is relevant. I was talking to Matt Natzel about this week, and he challenged me in this way. I thought it was really good. He said, Nick, when we talk about slavery today, we often focus on chattel slavery of the 19th century and fail to mention all forms of slavery and human trafficking that are still happening in the world today. I thought it was a really good point, and it highlighted something to me. There is a narrative out there in which Christians have actually been on the, quote, wrong side of history, that Christians were the ones defending slavery, while non-Christians, they were the ones who got slavery right. And that is historically false. It was actually Christians were on both sides of the issue, and the pioneer abolitionists were Christians. The idea that somehow slavery is a Christian issue misses the fact slavery is a human issue. Slavery has been around as long as humans have been sinning. And so I think a better way to frame the history of this issue leading up to today is to understand slavery is one of the great human sins in the history of humanity since we were fallen people. And it is actually the gospel of Jesus Christ that led to a world that began to say, this is wrong. It is the resources of Christians that actually started to oppose human trafficking and slavery. And some of the greatest work opposing human trafficking today is being done by Christian ministries and organizations. And so I reject that narrative that somehow Christians were the ones on the wrong side of slavery, the slavery issue. Humans were on the wrong side of slavery issue, and that included many Christians, particularly in the Americas. But Christians have also been on the other side of that issue. And so what we want to talk more about, and we'll try to bring this up again, is what are ways that we can be actively involved today in caring for people who are being trafficked and slavery as exists today. So if you have any questions or you want to process this more, please shoot me an email, niroland@fellowshipnwa. Thanks for listening, and I hope you have a great day.